Welcome to our second discussion in our series, Analysing the Islamic Response to the Rise of the Far Right. In yesterday's discussion, we introduced why we are talking about this series and what we will be looking at during these 5 nights. For example, we mentioned that Niall Ferguson, one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, has written in his book about the Great War, the Second World War, that the Second World War was predicated upon 3 trends taking place at one time. The first was a breakdown in the ethnic relationships between one group and another. The second was economic volatility. And the third was a decline of empires. And when you have these 3 things converging together at once, this is something that precipitates a world war, which ultimately took nearly 100 million lives over the space of 6 years. This tells us that when ethnic conflict takes place, when one community blames another, scapegoats another, reduces another in their humanity, this is often a prerequisite for mass murder, for genocide, and even for global wars. And then when you look at the statistics that are taking place, we mentioned that in certain countries across the West, we can see trends that are showing us that Muslims in particular and immigrants are being targeted through the terms of white supremacy, through the return of the rise of the far right. For example, in Germany, we mentioned that 44% of Germans polled only 2 years ago stated that they would prefer all Muslims to be banned from Germany. We mentioned, for example, that now in France, 30% of the vote goes to far-right political parties. We mentioned, for example, in the United States of America, Al-Yaqeen Institute has found that 2 out of 3 Muslim youths fear telling their classmates and their friends that they are Muslims. Such is the amount of Islamophobia upon the Muslim community today. This tells us about the trends that are taking place and therefore the demand on us to be able to examine how Islam responds to the rise of the far right. We mentioned the different things that we are going to be talking about. For example, we stated we want to highlight what are the arguments that the far right create, how do we respond to them, and then we want to look at the specific Islamic social order that might respond to the far right, and especially in the types of movements that we see here today in the United Kingdom and across the whole of the Western world as well. Last night, we started with the first argument from far-right, white supremacists and populist movements. And that was that there is such a thing as race. Humanity is divided into multiple races. And therefore, because some races are better than others, there inherently must be a hierarchy. There must be an order as to which race is better. And I asked you yesterday, which race do you think you belong to? Are you British Pakistani? Are you British Indian? What is the difference really between the two? Are you Arab? Are you African? Who made these terminologies and these races in the first place? Where did they come from? And what makes you think that you belong to such a race as opposed to any other race? Can that change? Is that stuck within you for the entirety of your life? And we highlighted that from the time of the 1600s to date, there has been certain scientific arguments that were created primarily by those in what we would call today the United States of America. Then it wasn't the United States of America. But in the Americas and across Europe, certain scientists created theories of race and stated that there are different types of people, and different types of people have within them innate attributes. Some are civilized, some are uncivilized. Some are prone to violence, some are not prone to violence. Some are prone to backwardsness, others are not prone to backwardsness. And we highlighted yesterday a number of different people throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th century that have contributed to this theory of race, that race is such a thing. And we mentioned, for example, one scientist believes that humanity is divided into 4 races. We mentioned yesterday another scholar that believes that humanity is divided into 5 races. Another scholar believed that humanity was divided into those races which are civilized, semi-civilized, and uncivilized. And we highlighted here that all of these things are socially constructed. Why were they socially constructed? Why did someone at that time wish to be able to divide people into categories and then place you within a fixed category and say you belong here and you don't belong there? Simply so that they could conquer you, simply so that they could rob from you, and simply so they could create laws which would endanger you into slavery. For example, we mentioned yesterday in the Americas, in the 1800s, there was something called anti-miscegenation laws, which were what? They ruled in law that white can only marry white and black can only marry black. And I do this because God doesn't see black and white. So they created a law and said, see, because your race is inferior and my race is superior, therefore, you cannot marry into this race. And we have this hierarchy in the political order. We can take office. We can become the president. You can't become. We can own land. You can't own land. All of these things were created for the purpose of putting you into slavery. Now, what we mentioned yesterday is, and this is very important, that the longer you and I, as Muslims, fail to see the world through the eyes of God and Islam, and the moment we adopt these other ideologies, we end up perpetuating these very same social orders that were created to enslave you in the first place. The longer you believe that you were born into a fixed race, and you tick that box, or you claim that you're from a race, it immediately means that you are perpetuating a 400-year project in order to ensure that you are kept down, so that your race is perceived as second class, third class, maybe even fourth class, and you cannot ascend above that, because science tells you that you were born into this race. The difference between this and Islam was mentioned yesterday. We mentioned in the verse that we recited in the Arabic khutbah just now, from chapter number 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 48. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the following, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ عَمَّا جَاءَكَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ. And we revealed to you the book with truth, verifying what came before it and being a guardian over it. Therefore, judge between them. Judge between people by what Allah has revealed, and do not follow their low desires. They have created a system for the purpose of hierarchy. Don't you follow it. Don't you judge by it. Do not judge between them by what they have put as their low desires, away from the truth, from what has come to you. Every one of you, we created a law and a way. And if Allah had pleased, He could have made you ummatan wahida. He could have made you one united community. But why does He allow these differences to continue? The purpose of which is one. He says, وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً وَلَكِنْ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ فِي مَا آتَاكُمْ. He wanted to test you by the different things that He has given to you. He's given one to you strength. He's given one to you resource. He's given to one nation, one community, different attributes. None of these are for the purpose of having a hierarchy in order to put one community down and one above. All of these things were given to you for the purpose of uniting, again, as an entire community. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't see black and white. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never claimed people were black and white. The Holy Prophet of Islam did not see people through the lens of their color of skin. If you and I see people through the lens of their skin and attribute to them a race, one which is lower, one which is higher, then we are perpetuating a system which was created to put you into slavery in the first place. Now tonight we need to move on from here and make certain conclusions and use it to be able to discuss our topic for tonight, which is the next set of two main arguments that come to us from white supremacists and from the far right. And those are, number one, the desire to have an ethno-state. What does an ethno-state mean? Does anyone know? A single ethnic group in one country, to remove all non-people or people from another ethno background, an ethnic background, so that the country is only of one type of person. And the second argument from the far right is that Muslims in particular should leave their faith, or at least they should be barred from practicing certain elements of their faith. How do we respond? Are we supposed to do this? Are we supposed to be apologetic or not? This will be our two discussions for tonight, inshaAllah. In order for us to be able to move on to these points, we need to be able to make one or two conclusions from this point about the theory of race and whether race really exists or not. Number one, it is entirely socially constructed. Individuals from the 16th century onwards created this idea, which means as much as it has been socially constructed, it can also be socially deconstructed as well, which means it just takes education. But if we ourselves are going to accept and perpetuate, then we've already given up. We've already defeated ourselves. The white supremacists that have created this order don't need to work very hard. If the very people who are there to be put at the lowest caste of humanity are the ones perpetuating this very system itself. So it requires us to have education in order to evolve our thinking towards a more honest and purified understanding of what humanity is. Number two, think about this. If this has been created for 400 years, since the 1600s, you've had 4 centuries of a global order that has existed in the minds of people. Imagine how strong that order is in the minds of people, that for 4 centuries people have grown up thinking that there is such a thing as a race and a dominant race and people of inherent superior qualities to anyone else. You can see how long this idea has been constructed into science and into the normative social order, into the world view of people, such that even Muslims have adopted these things for themselves without querying what the Quran says. From this, it tells us that white supremacist ideas have never gone away. They've always been there, even if they are latent. This is very important. Because for us to be able to defeat white supremacists, and in order to defeat the far right, not only at a political level, but also at a social level, not only at a social level, but at an education level, think about this issue from this particular angle. That we've had this idea so ingrained into us that actually this idea is so normative within the thinking of people that they don't even realize why it was created and how it has been used over periods of time. So now, for 400 years, this has existed. As a response to this, if there is a hierarchy, if you are inherently superior because you were born in one particular part of the world, because your genes were better than this person's, the outcome of this would be, what happens when you two end up mixing? What happens when you sit in a place together? What happens when you two spend too much time with each other? And because of this, this was the next argument that white supremacists used in order to argue that there should be separation of peoples. White and black should not mix. Brown and white should not mix. And because Muslims are inferior to white people, obviously you understand how I'm using these terms in the context of white supremacists, because Muslims are inferior, because they are more prone to violence, because they are more prone to being uncivilized, the moment you mix this group with this group, as an outcome, the superior group will be infected by the lower group. So what do we have to do? We have to keep them separate. This is the very foundation of the idea of an ethno-state, to have a state which reduces and removes people of a different race in order to ensure that this country is only white and only has Caucasian people sitting within that country. As I said yesterday, even the word Caucasian is created in the 1700s. It has no real meaning to it. Now understand that this is a real problem, because certain political parties in the United Kingdom have openly called for an ethno-state and the removal of Muslims from the United Kingdom. Most famously, for example, UKIP, the UK Independence Party. UKIP has come out consistently with a number of arguments to state that Muslims should be reduced, the number, or all Muslims should be removed. In fact, not only UKIP, but generally the far right tends to agree with this idea. Do you know what they stated in one of their manifestos in 2018? They stated that we will pay, if we get into power, we will pay for Muslims to be forced to leave the country, and if they don't accept that monetary offer to relocate back home, then the legislation would be in place to be able to remove them from the country altogether. The idea is that if they can get into power, then you would ultimately be removed from this country by your choice or forcibly. Where did this idea of an ethno-state come about? Whose initiations of this were it coming from? And where do we see the arguments for the ethno-state? And how do we respond to the arguments against an ethno-state? Yesterday I asked you all, have your pens and pads, have your phones out, put your phones on airplane mode, and write down these points. There is no point in me spending hours, months of research in order to present this to you, and tomorrow when you're faced with the need to be able to talk to someone about these issues, you do not have these points to hand. So please, have your phones out, put it on airplane mode so that you don't get distracted by Facebook and whatever WhatsApp messages comes. Then please write these points down, inshallah. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Joseph de Gobineau, D-E-G-O-B-I-N-E-A-U. Joseph de Gobineau was the first individual to create a theory which stated that when races mix, this is the downfall of a civilization or a society. He wrote a work which looked into this issue and argued that historically, when civilizations collapse, when societies collapse, the reason for their collapse is because races have mixed. And ultimately, the stronger race has been pulled down by the weaker race. The stronger race, for example, allows freedom of speech. Muslims apparently don't allow for freedom of speech. The stronger race, for example, has good governance. Muslims apparently don't have good governance, good policy, good government, and so on and so forth. Muslims are violent, prone to violence by nature. Other races are not. And so when these two races mix, it won't be that the superior race elevates the second, the second race will drag down the first race, according to the arguments of Joseph de Gobineau. Do you know who took this idea? Do you know who was one of the people that actually based his entire movement on de Gobineau and his writings? No small individual in history. Adolf Hitler. Hitler based his ideas on separation and why races and certain groups within society should be killed off the basis of what Joseph de Gobineau had actually written. The idea was that at the moment you have these races mix, this will cause the downfall of society. Now here, it is important to understand that when these white supremacists call for this, it is because they believe that they are going to absorb these bad features that exist from you and I, and such that we must be removed. Now the idea here is not only that we in this country would bring down this country because we are Muslims, because we are immigrants. There is another element to this concept of white supremacy and an ethno-state. And that is that there are a pure people and a real people that belong to this country, and there's a group of people that never really belonged to this country. And so it is the task of those real people and those who truly belong to remove those people who do not really belong. Do you remember that only in the previous year, in that white supremacist attack in Charlottesville in the United States of America, do you remember anyone who remember what they were chanting? They had those tiki torches. What they were shouting? What were they shouting? We shall not be replaced. The second element to this is demographics. And the belief is, and possibly rightly, that in certain states, especially we can see in Britain and in the United States of America, in terms of birth rates, immigrants, Muslim population is outgrowing indigenous population. And so over a period of time, they will become the minority. And so the fear is that we need to stop Muslims or immigrants from coming into the country, or we need to remove them from the country in order to ensure that they do not overtake the population and turn the country into a Muslim majority country. Obviously, we have to ask a really simple question. What's wrong with being a minority? We've been the minority for so long. If being a minority is so bad, why are you treating us so bad? We have to face being a minority every day within the society, but we put up with it, but we deal with it when it comes to legislation, when it comes to the real world outcome. If it is so bad and we have things so good, why is it that you're so worried about turning into a minority yourselves? So as a result of this, there is a fear of Muslims, of immigrants, and this is the reason as to why people need to be removed from this country. Now here, the idea is that there was once a perfect society of white people, and it was a homogeneous society, and there was never any problems, and only when immigrants came were problems within the society. And so we need to remove these people from society in order to return to a healthy, homogeneous, perfect country like we once were. A third reason for this, the third argument from white supremacists about why they should return to an ethno-state is a very important one. Please note this one down. And that is social Darwinism. Social Darwinism argues that there is a survival of the fittest. Darwin never came up with the term survival of the fittest, but you understand survival of the fittest. The idea of social Darwinism is that throughout time, when there has been tribes, when there has been civilizations, they have always come into contact with one another. And whichever one was strongest outlasted the other one. So your civilization was strongest, it outlasted this one. Their idea is that when you have all of these civilizations and all of these different races, instead of them being put together, actually you should allow for these different races to be separate so that you can clearly see which is producing the best from within each and every society. Their argument is this: we used to be tribes and all live separately from each other. And so when you were all separate and you were separate, we saw the best come from you. You produced the best from you, and you produced the best from you. And that is why we were able to see these different races and the qualities from different races. If this is how society was tens of thousands of years ago, when tribes were separated from each other, nations were separated from each other by geography, why can't we just go back to that? And ultimately, if all Muslims were together, you would see their societies collapse. If all blacks were together, you would see that their societies would collapse. And if all whites were together, you would see how far all white people come. So allow us, that's the way it was historically, allow us to go back to that particular social order around the world. These are the three arguments for the ethno-state from white supremacists. The question would be, how do they achieve this? How then does a party then achieve to remove all Muslims from Britain, such as is proposed by UK Independence Party or other different groups such as UKIP? Two ways: either through violence or through policy, through governmental policy. And so if these individuals are allowed to be able to gain the narrative, and if they are able to have a march and a number increase in share, political share, as a result of this, these people will get into power and they will be in a position to be able to place this into their system of governance and place this into policy. How do we then understand how this might happen, and what are our responses to this issue? If you were sitting debating with a white supremacist, if you were sitting talking to someone from the far right persuasion, how then do you convince them that this is something morally wrong? How then do you convince them that this is something that we would never allow in a civilized society? How do they go about doing this? The first way that they have to go about doing this is they have to create an image of a pure people that belong to Britain. They are a superior group of people, and thus there are people who do not belong to Britain or any other country. Do you remember Nigel Farage at the time when it came to the Brexit vote? Do you remember he had a poster, and it had a picture of tens of thousands of Syrians, internally displaced, refugees fleeing the war that Daesh and ISIS and Al Saud and America and Britain had placed upon Syria? As they were fleeing this violence, this picture of them was taken, and it had a caption: Britain is at breaking point. These people don't belong. They should never be allowed to come here. And anyone who looks like them, anyone who talks like them, they do not belong to this pure society. And so as long as we perpetuate this image of those that truly belong and those who don't belong, this is the starting point of being able to have a policy of defining those people who belong and those people who don't belong. After having done this, if getting into power is successful, such as a UKIP or such as an EDL or whatever branches of Nazism comes out in the next few years, the next thing would be to extrapolate a certain group of people from another group of people and start to sift one group from another people. After this, you get into a point of having laws. In legal terms, this is called discriminatory legalism, where you're able to place in law certain types of policy that will legally allow you to discriminate this person against this person. And you can say one type of law appeals and applies to this person, but it doesn't apply to this person. This is something that is present or possible within the legal system. Now, how then do we argue this? How then do we understand the various terms around this and argue against this particular issue. Where do we go from? Do we go from a moral perspective? Do we argue that races don't exist? The way in which we have to deal with this is to call this ideology out for what it is, and that is fascism. And the reason why this is important is because most people are very afraid of the term fascism. They know what happened in Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s, and so no one wants to return back to fascism. What's happening at the moment is these ideas are being rebranded, not as fascist ideas, but often they're being rebranded as illiberal ideas or conservative ideas. My friends, there is a large difference between conservatism, illiberalism, and fascism. And you need to know what these are so that when political commentators, when politicians, when radio hosts say that actually removing Muslims from this society or removing Jews from any society or removing immigrants from a society is conservatism or it's just an illiberal democracy, you need to know how to be able to respond, and that is through understanding these different terms and what they are. Conservatism is what? Conservatism is rooted on a sense of history, a sense of family values, and preserving a status quo such that there is not a huge shift in society too fast that a society breaks down by it becoming too evolved too quickly. An illiberal society is a society that will say, we prohibit, for example, freedom of gathering, or we put prohibitions upon freedom of speech, such as with the media. Or, for example, we state that we will move from a type of democracy away from democracy. This is illiberalism. Fascism, however, this is very important. Fascism is not either of these two things. Fascism is ultra-nationalism that is based on xenophobia, based on a type of idea that seeks to be able to use violence to remove and to put down one type of class of people or one congregation of people from within a society. When you see people like the EDL, when you see their types of people calling for war on the streets, when you see them saying that Muslims are not welcome within society, when you see they say that immigrants are not welcome in society, this is the textbook definition of fascism, and it needs to be called out, and no one here needs to be afraid of calling out these policies and exactly what UKIP stands for or exactly what the far right stands for. Fascism exists and has always existed for the purpose of removing and oppressing sectors of society for the purpose of creating ultra-nationalism through the practice of xenophobia. If you don't call it out when it happens, then we are the ones that allow it to grow step by step by step. I want you to contrast this now with the example of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Look at the difference between a UKIP ideology, a far-right ideology, and the ideology of Islam, and how profoundly beautiful Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam were in the way in which they expressed how a society should be. I want all of you to know this book, and please read this book and make sure that when you are talking about the Holy Prophet of Islam, you can extend to people a copy of this book online, downloadable, or actual soft copy, hard copy of this book. This book is called The Message by Ayatollah Shaykh Jaffer Subhani. May Allah protect him and grant him a long life. Shaykh Subhani has written the biography of the Holy Prophet of Islam called The Message. In there is a document which is called the Constitution of Medina. The Constitution of Medina. This is the first ever document in history as a constitution of faiths and sects living together to prosper one amongst each other in society. I want you to understand how Islam sees people and them living together as a social order versus the way white supremacists look at a social order. In this document, the Holy Prophet of Islam wrote a constitution so that all faiths and sects of Medina could sign up to this. It was a 40-point document. Who was in Medina? There were Jews, there were Christians, there were Zoroastrians, there were Sabians. And there were different sects from within each and every one of these faiths. Meaning that there was huge multiplicity, that there was huge plurality amongst the thinking of people, and the rivalries that would have existed amongst the thought processes of those different communities. You and I, as Muslims, again, as I state, because we may not be aware of the Quran or the prophetic model, we often take things without realizing. Sometimes we think that when we hear about the word ummah, we think the ummah primarily responds to the Muslim ummah. This is not correct. Listen to this. The ummah, according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first ummah is of all mankind, and that the majority, as much as possible, mankind should live in harmony with one another. We think an ummah is primarily the Muslim ummah. It's not. In the Quran, 70% of the usage, the isti'malat of the word ummah is for the whole of mankind. White supremacists will say, look at these Muslims, they want to subscribe to the ummah. They want to make sure the ummah reigns supreme upon us. Yes, we do. But the meaning of the ummah is humanity. That is the meaning of the word ummah by priority. Now, when the Holy Prophet of Islam wrote the Constitution of Medina and gathered all of these faiths and sects and tribes to sign to this document, do you know what he said in the first point of this document? He said, anyone who signs up to this document, irrespective of your faith and creed, you are considered to be as much of the ummah as a Muslim is considered to be part of the ummah. Don't think that we are separate from anyone. Don't place yourself in rivalry to Christians or to Jews or to any other sect or any other faith or non-faith. The only way a society can truly move forward is when there is balance, justice, equilibrium, and growth of all people as opposed to one sect or one group of people. In this room, if I made sure that only you got chai and you didn't, I think these guys would be pretty upset. If I made sure only you had access to education, but these didn't, there would be an imbalance in society. Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, is narrated to have said, Ma ummiratul buldan illa bimithli adl. Societies, nations, communities cannot flourish unless there is justice, balance, equilibrium between them. One group wants to remove all of you. Islam said no. Actually, you are all together. And the only way you can flourish is when you are all together. Because without learning from one another, there is no way that you can improve yourselves. This is the difference between white supremacists and Islam. And you and I have to be able to show the difference between these two ideologies, between these two faiths, between these two religions as such. It goes further. Look at the Quran. Take your thinking from the Quran. Take your thinking from the Quran. Take your thinking from the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Holy Quran that all the faiths of Medina had access to the paradise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as much as anyone else had access to the paradise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Mentions twice in the Quran. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions those who believe يعني the Muslims. إن الذين آمنوا واليهود والنصارى, the Jews and the Christians, والصابئين and the Sabi'een, من آمن بالله, from amongst those who truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, واليوم الآخر, and the day of judgment. If they do amal salih, and believe in the last day, لا خوف عليهم, there shall be no fear for them. They shall have their reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine now when the Quran offers paradise to Jews, Christians, Muslims equally, who is it then that can actually say that we place ourselves as superior towards another group? How then can we ban another group? How then can we say we want to be separated from another group if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one offering the potential of paradise to everyone within this faith society? Look at the difference. One group wants to expel another. One group doesn't want to work with another. And my friends, this goes the same for Muslims internally with Shia Sunni polemics as well. The Quran offers paradise to all of these groups. How is it then that I can lower one group and consider myself to be superior, want to expel one group from another? The difference between the Islamic worldview and the way in which white supremacists and UKIP and the far right want to be able to create the world and the country of Britain. Now I ask you a simple question. Which one is more beautiful? Which one appeals to the humanity within you? Where Islam offers paradise to every faith and demands that our completion is based on us living together, learning from each other, harmonizing together, getting the best out of each other. And UKIP that wants to say that you are lesser than them and expel them from this country. Which faith, which type of world do people want to live in? And if you are able to show this type of Islam, then inshallah, this will be an easy way to be able to respond to these sorts of challenges. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. From here, we can see that white supremacy is an ugly idea. And the idea of removing people from a society, the idea of people being unable to coexist, being unable to tolerate one another. And there are other arguments that have been created in order to perpetuate this sort of idea. And for example, they will say that we will pay for you to leave. This is the will of the people. The will of the people is to remove Muslims from society. The reality is that actually no one can judge what the will of a society is. The person who created this idea, the will of the people, was a person by the name of Carl Schmitt, who was part of Weimar Germany. Carl Schmitt said that there's a will of the German people to remove Jews, to remove people who don't look like us. And so we are acting out the will of the people. There is no such thing as the will of the people. You can never judge the will of millions of people. The moment there are two people, you and I will differ on something. How then can you collectivize all of us and say all of us want one and exactly the same thing? The second argument that we wanted to talk about this evening before we conclude is the argument that comes from white supremacists that Muslims should leave their faith, abandon their faith, or at least part of their faith. And in the West at the moment, we are seeing certain trends towards the banning of certain practices for Muslims to be able to practice within the society freely and fairly. For example, a number of them. In certain countries here in Europe, mosques have been banned from being built. Minarets have been banned from being built. Hijab is prohibited from being worn in certain public institutions. Or, for example, circumcision is being prohibited. Halal food is being prohibited. The question needs to come is, what are these individuals demanding from us? If you look at the white supremacist argument, it's very simple. Ideally, they want you to abandon your religion altogether. And if not, they want you to leave parts of your religion. What do they want you to leave? They want you to leave the Quran, and they want you to leave the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. By God, you can cut us into 1,000 pieces, and you will never get us to leave the Quran and the Holy Prophet of Islam. The Quran talks about this. And it mentions, for example, that one of the types of kufr is to believe in a part of Islam and then to willfully leave another part of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks in the Holy Quran, أَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِبَعْضِ الْكِتَابِ? Do you believe in a part of the book? وَتَكْفُرُونَ بِبَعْضٍ? Do you then belie, reject, do kufr to another part? Is this the type of religion that you want? That you can just play with it and accept one thing and then remove another thing because it becomes easy for you, because it becomes difficult for you, because one group is pressurizing you? This is what is being demanded of you, especially my young friends. And this is tantamount to kufr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says within the Quran. Now the reality is that if Islam is true, if Islam is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it is perfect. That is the assumption, correct? Therefore, if one part of it is perfect, all of it is perfect. Not parts of it are perfect and parts of it are not perfect. Some parts work here, other parts don't work there. This is what is being demanded from you. That in order for you to stay within this country, you need to reject verses of the Quran. You need to reject that the Prophet was universal for you and that you could actually take him as your example par excellence. We do not accept this. We do not allow for this to come in, and we reject it from its outset. The reality is that every part of Islam is as beautiful as another. And the moment you start to reject one, the question would be, where do you stop? And when will you stop? Why then do you not reject any other part of Islam or Islam altogether? I want you to see the perfection and beauty of this religion through the eyes of Her Eminence, Lady Fatima al-Zahra, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayha. Look at the beauty of this religion and the way in which she enacted this religion. You'll remember that famous story that when the Holy Prophet of Islam brings a blind man into the house. When Rasulullah brings this man into the house, Lady Fatima alayha salam says to Rasulullah, give me a moment, allow me to put on and adorn myself with my hijab. The Prophet, perfect, already knowing the mind of his daughter, but still asks this question and says, oh my dear daughter, but he is blind. He cannot see you. You do not need to wear your hijab in front of him. She responds and says, but oh my dear father, it is not for him that I wear this hijab. It is for myself that I wear this hijab in front of him. Am I not prone to any thoughts? Am I not prone to sitting in front of this human being and having shaitan attack me? It is not just for him, it is for me that I sit with my hijab. Imagine the beauty and the perfection of this religion in its truest form. That this is the way in which we are brought up to think about our own self-respect and the respect of another human being. Do you wish to leave this religion? Do you wish to relieve yourself of a part of this religion? And where do you want to go? To which other religion do you wish to go? To what element of white supremacy will you take yourselves to? If they demand from you to leave your religion, show them the beauty of your religion, because it was through the beauty of Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam that even the most envious and people with the worst of enmity would turn towards the beauty of this religion. You will remember that when that enemy of Ali ibn Abi Talib came towards the city of Medina, he came towards Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, and he began to abuse Ali ibn Abi Talib, began to abuse Imam al-Hasan and say to him, your father was this, your father was that, your father was this. This is the same type of abuse that you and I get in our own time today. Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam responded by saying what? Oh man, it seems as though that you have misunderstood who we are. If you need a place to stay tonight, we will give it to you. If you need food, we will give it to you. If you need a means of travel to be able to go on your way, we will give it to you. If you need a change of clothes, we will give it to you. After having offered all of these things one after another, the man then turns to him and says, indeed, Allah knows where to place His message. I came here to Medina hating your father and you. I leave here saying, Ashhadu anna aliyan hujjatullah salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. This is the religion that we have. This is the religion that we wish to be able to show in front of people. And we will never leave this type of religion for anything besides it. Tonight, we have spoken about two things. What are the arguments for an ethno-state? And that there are people who will be demanding from you to leave your religion. We do not need to become apologetic. We do not need to apologize for any part of our religion. Our responsibility is to show Islam in its truest sense. These are the three arguments primarily of white supremacists. The first one yesterday, that race exists. Race does not exist. It is a social construct. Number two, they want to be able to state that this will become a white-only country. We do not accept this. The beautiful way to live is in harmony with one another, to get the best out of one another. And lastly, to be able to prove that Islam is so inherently beautiful that you and I do not need to leave any part of it. Tomorrow, we will ask the following question. Why does society become discontented? Why does it turn upon each other? And where do we see the history of racism in Britain, starting with racism towards the Irish in the 1800s and 1900s, and towards the Jewish community in the mid-1900s, and then turning towards the Muslim community from after World War II. We will begin to understand how racism is endemic within the British society, and then we can start talking about how Islam can be a source of changing that for the better, inshaAllah. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi at-tahirin.